state of economic depression, in the state of depletion of the resources of our planet because of the greed of psychopaths who thought they could create their own reality. Well, look at the reality they created.
You're listening to The Truth Perspective on the SOT Radio Network. The world for people who think.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Truth Perspective. We are talking today on September 4th, and this is going to be the first episode probably in a series. We probably won't do it every week, but it's something we'll return to again and again. We're going to be talking about Ponerology, and in the studio today we have William Barbet.
Hello, world.
Elon Martin.
Hi, everyone.
And I'm Harrison Cayley. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to do this, besides having just started rereading the book, is that it is kind of a notoriously difficult book. So we figured, what the heck, why not just go through it chapter by chapter and talk about some of the most important points in it. And when speaking, it's easier to get points across in short sentences without a whole lot of big words, kind of. So we'll be trying to do that and giving some examples, kind of as a supplement to the book, and hopefully as a little prod to actually read it if you haven't. And then after that, we're going to just talk about some of the usual stuff, get into a few stories, and hopefully Brent will call in with a cop roundup. But to start out, Ponerology, introduction, first chapter of the book. It's probably one of the easiest chapters in the book. But it's very interesting because, having read it now, 10 years after first reading it, you see just how much of the book really is kind of contained in that introduction and what gets introduced in it. And Lobaczewski does this, the way I see it, with three stories. So he basically tells three stories from his past. One when he was a young child, another when he was just about to graduate from university, and another just an anecdote that he heard about a scientist. And he relates these three stories, and the way I see it, kind of giving a background for why he actually wrote the book, what prepared him to write the book, what inspired him, the events in his life that inspired him to actually do the research to write the book, and also why it's important, and why it's a book that needed to be written and needs to be read, ideally by a very large portion of the human race. We'll see if we ever get there. But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it seems that Lobaczewski was very much a product of his time. He was, as you mentioned, Harrison, he was kind of these stories that he relates are personal and convey an experience or experiences that he's had in university as a child that compelled him to search further into the origins of evil. You could argue that he is, and his study of evil is as much a product of his environment and the political situation at the time, which was Poland in, I believe it was the late 40s, as something that was intrinsic to his being, a curiosity, a questioning, a moral, having a value for morals and higher ethics and standards for human beings. So out of this time and place, and I think what is intrinsic to who he was as a person, came this incredibly profound and necessary investigation into macro-social evil.
Well, maybe let's get into those three stories, because the first one that he tells is of being in school. I think it was the the year before graduation, and all of a sudden, well, the communists take over, and all of a sudden this new professor comes into the university. There was a bit of backstory in other chapters about what was going on, how a lot of the professors were fired. So, new guys were brought in. Basically, the education system became this kind of state-run, party-run system. And this new professor who came in, there were the important traits about this guy were that he was ostensibly a scientist. I mean, he was teaching these students almost graduated in psychology, but they were pretty much just indoctrination lectures. And this guy himself had no scientific background. There was even rumors that he hadn't even finished high school, and so he came in every week and delivered this lecture to them where it was obvious to Lobaczewski and some of his friends that this guy was obviously, there was something wrong with this guy. He wasn't a normal human being, and he wasn't a scientist. He would treat them with contempt and mix in science with just these random unscientific ideas, just kind of fantasy notions that didn't really have any scientific backing to them. He was just basically spouting pseudoscience or not even science, and displayed no capacity for critical thought. So he was just presenting these ideas as if they were, God's truth, except being a communist atheist, he wouldn't have called it that. And something seemed very wrong to Lobaczewski, and of course, it was like a violation. They felt, here's this guy coming in, all of a sudden you feel this pressure to conform and to accept what this guy was saying, even though all these students had been trained for all these previous years to think critically, and naturally they rejected all of this. Except there's two aspects to this. One is the figure of the professor himself, but the other is the reaction of the students themselves. And this proved to be a big, one of the key points that would inspire his further research, and part of the phenomenon itself, this idea of a pathocratic system or a pathological social political system. And that was that even if he and a lot of his friends just saw right through it, and it even seemed crazy to them, like how could anyone actually believe this? It's ludicrous. He found that certain of their colleagues, their peers, totally bought into it. And so he describes it as if, some of these people who previously you could have a kind-hearted and critical discussion with, totally changed. Not only did they join the party, but they would no longer respond to what he calls, I think, benevolent or critical discussion or counters to their points. They became zealots or fanatics to an extent. And so this puzzled Lobaczewski and his friends, and so they tried to figure out what was going on. They were like, well, what's the common similarity between all these people? And it wasn't intelligence. If anything, they were maybe a little bit lower in intelligence or talent, at their university studies or in general, but they came from aristocratic families, religious families, totally different backgrounds and social statuses. So that wasn't what was going on, and the fact that they couldn't find any common denominator among these people made them think, okay, well, this has to reside somewhere deeper, at a kind of biopsychological level. And there's something about these people that makes them this way, in addition to other factors. So that was the initial impetus for engaging in this study, to find out, first of all, like what's up with this psychopath that they've put in as the new professor, and how does this work on the normal people? So it actually led to a few positive things, this experience. First of all, this guy, this lunatic professor, was actually the inspiration for this book. So without this nut job, we wouldn't have Ponerology. So I guess we can, if we could find his grave, maybe we could go and put some dead roses on it or something. But not only was there that, there was also the fact that this experience led to a period of like self-study for Lobaczewski and his peers. You're thrown into this environment, and it caused, first of all, it caused cognitive dissonance. It was a form of suffering. I mean, they didn't enjoy it. They were forced to picture 1984, like the experience of the main character in that novel, and being forced to go to indoctrination lectures or party meetings, and being forced to pretend that you believe something that you don't. And not only that, but to believe something that goes against all of your previous values, the things that you think are important. And so this prompted a period of self-study. Okay, well, what's going on? And that in itself is one of the products of not only that experience, but of reading the book, is that the things that Lobaczewski gets into in the book have to do with your own personal psychology and the cognitive errors and kind of instinctive programs that humans have that cause them not to see reality as it is, that cause them, by not seeing reality as it is, this is basically an opening for being exploited, manipulated, and controlled in the worst form in this kind of macro-social political evil that Lobaczewski talks about. So by reading the book, you actually are forced to look at yourself and do a little bit of self-analysis on your own mind, the way you take in information, the way you form beliefs or opinions, and then you have to ask yourself, well, are these valid? What am I missing in the big picture of how I see the world and how I see myself? By doing that, you gain not only knowledge about yourself, but a kind of power over how you react to the world around you, including what is, and it could be described as just horrendous evil surrounding you and oppressing you. And so there's that. There's also...
Well, Harrison, I would just comment on a few of those points. I think what Lobaczewski realized also was that there was this kind of imposition of irrationality that he and his fellow students were experiencing. It's as though there were a kind of emotional button pushing, where you were being conditioned to think, react, respond emotionally. And this was repeated lecture after lecture after lecture as a form of brainwashing, or at the very least, if you don't want to go to that extreme, you can say that it was a kind of a damage being inflicted on the critical faculties of these students. This reminded me in an offhanded way of an experience I once had in an office I worked in. I had a meeting with the boss, who could be a very nice guy at some times, and also extremely irrational and emotional. And one day we had a meeting for about 3 hours where he spoke at length with very little input from the rest of us. And after the meeting, I turned to someone and I asked, half sincerely, but half also realizing that what we heard wasn't exactly coherent. And I asked my coworker, do you understand what he just said? And she turned to me very nonchalantly and said, no. So the point here, I think, is that we can experience this kind of irrational enforcement of non-thinking or appeal to the emotions from anyone. And it's one of the other points in political ponerology that really drives home how important it is to be self-aware and to deeply consider, who is talking to you and why.
Well, one of the interesting things I found about reading this, kind of like I said earlier, was that it kind of foreshadows things throughout the book, and how, especially this story of the professor, it points towards things that would later become significant for Lobaczewski, in the decades after, and also just in the specific points that he talks about in this process of what he calls ponerogenesis. So, for example, there's just the simple fact that the professor was uneducated, that he wasn't qualified for his position. I mean, he was qualified in terms of his, propaganda level and his membership party, but when it comes down to it, like the actual kind of requirements for being a professor, for teaching students, he lacked the credentials and he lacked the actual ability. Now, in the next chapter, he gets into this, and there's a phrase that he uses to call this phenomenon, and it's like upward adjustment. So there's kind of this negative phenomenon where people who aren't qualified get all of, in a system like this and in a society that's basically failing, people that are unqualified get all of the high good positions that require a certain level of skill, but these people are not qualified for them, so they do a poor job. And the people who are qualified and who are educated can't get these positions. So this professor kind of embodied this thing that was actually like a symptom of a much wider spread problem. And I think we can see that in, at least in Western culture today, maybe not to, maybe not 100%. So it's not like every qualified person can't get a good job and all positions are held by unqualified people, but you can certainly see the trend. Like, just look at the number of people with, university degrees and doctors, especially, I know a few from other countries who have come over to either Canada or the U.S. and who can't get a position, end up working at McDonald's or something or in a factory. And this was the case with Lobaczewski himself in the 80s when he came to the States and couldn't get a job in his profession, so he ended up doing factory work. And it works like this for a purpose, and that's because the people, as you find out later in the book, like the people that make up the new kind of ruling class in a pathocracy are pretty much all, they pretty much all have a personality disorder of some sort. And there's only a certain number of people in any population that have these personality disorders. So let's say, Lobaczewski gives a number of 6%. So you take that 6%. Well, now, what percentage of those people are actually going to be these educated, qualified people? Well, there's a very tiny percentage, if any, of these people are actually fit for these types of positions. So naturally, in this kind of system, you won't get people who are qualified to be in any of these positions actually get them. You have these stupid, pathological jerks, to use just a common phrase, that get in these positions, and that phenomenon itself, it provides this kind of, it makes an environment that is not, how to put it, doesn't lead to any kind of fulfilling life. So if you are, qualified and talented, and you can't get a position, and you're forced to work at a job that doesn't fulfill your full potential, you're going to feel depressed. You're going to feel like, what's the point? And you're not going to do a good job. In fact, you're going to do a worse job than you would have in a job that was more suited to your talents and capabilities. So there's that, and there's also this the fact that at first, Lobaczewski and his friends were just hit with this. It's like it just came out of nowhere. Well, what's going on? Who is this guy, and why are some of our friends kind of getting taken in by him? And at the time, he called it a transpersonification process. Like, it was as if these people's personalities just changed overnight. And there's a really good kind of case study in this, an example in Sebastian Haffner's Defying Hitler, where he describes this, the people that he used to be friends with, all of a sudden it's like their opinions changed. They became these, fascist fanatics, and, there was nothing he could say to them. There was nothing he could do to change their minds. It was just like this total change in their personality. So this led Lobaczewski, down the path of research and eventually coming to a few different conclusions. Two of which were regarding the people that were taken in by this. And the first is that it wasn't necessarily a transpersonification process for a lot of these people. These were people who had these existing personality disorders. They were psychopaths of some sort. And it was essentially just, that was the opportunity then for them to take off their masks. So it's like these were the people they were the whole time. It's like they just never had the opportunity to kind of find their own team, so to say, and take the mask off and just be like, okay, well, this is who I am, and I'm not rational, and I'm not a very nice guy, and I was just deceiving you the whole time. Not that they actually said that, but the other one was that a lot of these people, he describes it as a temporary phenomenon, as a result of what he called psychopathological induction. Now, if you think about induction, like induction is a psychological world. Like if you think about hypnotic induction, like when you're hypnotized, he's basically describing a form of mind control, brainwashing. It's like these people are basically hypnotized or spellbinded into this state. There's something about them, something about their psychology that makes them susceptible, but they're not psychopaths. They're not totally reprehensible people, but they become a victim to this. To whatever the professor is kind of putting out there. And that leads to the third conclusion, is that the professor, this is something that Lobaczewski only realized years later, was that the professor actually knew what he was doing. And he was consciously using these techniques to fish out the amenable individuals. He basically knew, in this crowd, I know that by speaking in this way and saying these certain things, by acting in this way, behaving in this way, I'm going to find the people who are basically susceptible to this kind of, mind programming, brainwashing, this hypnotic technique, and I'm going to find the people that are like me. But the downside of that is Lobaczewski points out that he was, probably disappointed with the numbers. He thought he'd get a lot more of them. But the main point being that this guy knew exactly what he was doing, and it was a conscious technique. So he knew that he could go into this classroom and just by behaving in a certain way, pick out, or not only pick out individuals, but get these people to basically volunteer to join his party, join his movement. And that's the way that this works. Is that it's like this strange kind of magnetism, like iron filings, on a page with a magnet. You just hover the magnet over, and boom, the iron filings come out of the woodwork, and that's what these. That's the way I see the phenomenon that Lobaczewski is describing here.
And you can also argue that the professor knew that with the sheer force of his personality and in his position of power, that he was going to be cowing, even if there wasn't that large a percentage of people who took his side vehemently, that there would be a certain number of authoritarian followers or individuals who were so browbeat, so oppressed by his talks,
or enamored,
or enamored, that they, that they would offer little to no resistance and go along with the crowd, the social proof. So, an argument could be made that even if it is a very small percentage of people who do get ponerized or transpersonified with this type of thinking, that the sheer force of their personalities and behavior will have an effect on a number of other people who would not ordinarily succumb or be susceptible to this type of thinking, but will just kind of offer up no resistance because they don't know what's happening either. So there's that.
Well, the next story that he tells is the one about the naturalist, in the Amazon basin or somewhere, and he's walking through a cave or a forest, I can't remember, and this basically vampire bat latches onto his neck. And he says, of course, the normal response, the immediate response, I mean, how do you respond when, like, a spider drops on your face or, you've got some kind of nasty bug on your shirt? Like, think most people kind of flip out, right? And they, oh my God, try to brush it off, dance around, run in circles.
Kill it.
Yeah. And, but the story that he gives is that this guy just kind of, he knew what the creature was. He knew that this was its way of feeding, so he just kind of calmly, grabbed it and took it off of its neck. And he uses that kind of as this symbol for the, what was attacking Poland at the time, and not only Poland but other countries, in the form of, what's called communism, but communism isn't the best description for it, because it's, it's the same thing with fascism. It can be the same thing with any kind of capitalistic or democratic political ideology. But it was like a vampire bat sucking the blood of any country. But that the proper or the necessary way to approach it is as this scientist. Because if you react strictly on that first emotion that you feel, there's no inspiration or like impetus to actually study it and to find out what's going on.
A critical distance.
A critical distance, yeah. And an intellectual distance is how he puts it. So, Gimpy in the forum just said, I just saw this, you realize you do know karaoke when karate, sorry. You realize you do know karate. Exactly. So, when you get attacked by a bug, you realize you have a lot better fighting skills than you thought. And you can do backflips and, mid-air somersaults. But this thing about, like, critical distance, I was thinking about that because I think that, like, when you see images, you hear stories about atrocities and just the really nasty stuff that goes on in the world. It's natural, totally natural, to feel that visceral emotional response. And so I don't think here, at least, that Lobaczewski is saying that that's wrong or a bad thing to feel that response. It's just that if you just feel that response and then just immediately act on it, you won't actually learn anything about the situation. And if you put that and you take an example and you put it into your everyday life, like let's say you have an encounter with a psychopath and you have no idea what's going on, you just know that this guy's evil, and then you have, let's say you get in some kind of altercation with this guy and you just go crazy and then you just, in a fit of rage, kill him, you haven't learned anything. And I think that's kind of the situation that you can expand to on this wider level. If you just react based on that emotion, then essentially you don't understand what's going on. You don't understand what it was about you that made you susceptible, that made you fall for being duped, for example, by a con man, and you don't know what it is about the con man himself that, what's acting in, what's the dynamic going on, how does it work, what's he looking for, what are his intentions, what's going on in his brain, what's, is just what's going on. And that's why when he's talking about, in this chapter, he says, basically, if we were to, put together a library of all the horrible things about history and politics, it would be, first of all, it would be a pretty good library, but it would lack, one book. The implication being it would lack this book, Ponerology, something that puts it all together. But you have this book and you have just kind of these descriptions of wars and political intrigue, backstabbing, atrocities, genocides. And it's all informative. It all tells you something, but it doesn't explain it. And it doesn't give what he calls the specific causes and processes that explain what's going on, how it got to be that way, basically like a disease. It doesn't say what the initial susceptibility of the patient was. It doesn't explain what the disease is, how the disease gets transmitted. It's basically just a description of the symptoms. Oh, well, this person gets lesions all over their body, starts vomiting, and then eventually their body consumes itself and it dies. Well, if all you have is this description of a disease and basically, the stages that the body goes through before the individual dies, that doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you how to protect other people from it. It doesn't tell you how to treat the disease. And you don't actually learn anything about the disease itself. You learn about, how this person gets sick and dies.
Well, Harrison, you talked about having this reaction, this emotional reaction that could leave people vulnerable or set up to respond in a way that's been kind of designed.
Yeah.
There's a flip side to this as well, I think, and that is that many people who aspire to be rational and reasonable project this same kind of thinking onto other people, and continue to apply their own standards of reason and rationality to people who have no capability or appreciation for this type of interpersonal or otherwise relationship. And at some point, having this psychological knowledge that, okay, I've tried now to be reasonable and rational, and it hasn't worked. What this material enables one to do, I think, is to at least be open to the possibility that what you're dealing with cannot be reasoned with. You can't apply rational standards to an individual who has none. And coming to accept that reality, which is why this is so important, that there is a reality to individuals who operate very differently from how we would like to operate, how we would like to function, and how we would like to deal with others. Just coming to this acceptance at least affords a person the possibility of behaving more strategically, for understanding what it is they're really up against. And it's from that baseline that we can more successfully navigate our relationships to psychopaths or people who have narcissistic personality disorder, anywhere on that spectrum, either on an interpersonal level or, as we try and do on SOT, on a kind of macro-social level.
Well, getting back to one of the first things you said there, it's like it's not just that you can't reason with these people, but that psychopaths, for example, are so knowledgeable in a sense of the way humans work, the way normal humans work, that they understand our emotional reactions and they know how to manipulate them and to use them to their advantage. So it's, if you don't have knowledge like this, and if you don't have self-control and kind of an awareness of your emotions and an ability to maybe contain an emotional reaction, well, they are experts at provoking emotional reactions and getting you to act out the way that you've always acted out and that you naturally act out, in a fit of moral indignation or rage, and it's really a now I've got you, you whatever kind of moment where you can see it in TV shows, in movies, you can see it in politics with the kind of, provocations that go on between countries. Mm-hmm. It's like, I'm going to push you just far enough till, you're feeling, well, this is an outrage. I'm not going to put up with this. And then I'm going to strike back. And that's exactly what they wanted you to do. That's how wars get started. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to, send a few of my people into your country. I'm going to set up this false flag attack. I'm going to pretend that you attacked me. Or I'm just going to, inch closer and closer until you feel so threatened that you're the first one to throw the punch. And then you're blamed for it, even though you were obviously provoked to do it and it was intentional. They wanted you to do it as an excuse for them to then, quote, retaliate, out of self-defense. I mean, Israel is a master of that one. When if you would have understood what was going on and understood that you were being provoked. I mean, there's a good scene in Stranger Things about that. The little kid getting provoked by the bully. I mean, it happens on every interpersonal level. From when you're a kid dealing with a schoolyard bully to, if you're a leader of a country dealing with an aggressive military empire. It's the same dynamics. And that's one of the main points of Lobaczewski's book, is that this goes on everywhere at every level, and no one talks about it. No one knows what's going on. No one has made this connection. And that's why in this vast library of, books on evil in human history, there isn't a book like Ponerology. That's why it's such an important book. So,
Well, just on that macro social level, we had an article on SOT this morning that I encourage folks to have a look at. It's Key Points of Putin's Bilderberg Interview, quote, "Do you want another Cuban Missile Crisis?" End quote. Where basically Putin subjected himself to an interview with Bloomberg News, where the interviewer was basically, his name is John Micklethwaite, who is a Bilderberger. For those of you who don't know, it's a very exclusive kind of elite club of globalists who have very many interlocking interests. And if you read the article, you'll see how this guy tried to goad Putin into responding aggressively and into fitting into this Western narrative as this aggressor. So, like, one of the things that he asked him about was, regarding, Putin's feelings about the EU, and trying to elicit a response suggesting that Putin was somehow against the EU. And, Putin basically responds, obviously we disagree with the sanctions, but we wish them well. And, we'd like things to go well with the EU, which is not something that makes good copy in Western media these days regarding Putin. So just to bring this point home, it seems as though Putin has psychological knowledge of the people who have deemed him the enemy. And he is forever dodging traps and goadings and these these kinds of traps that are threatening to make him look bad, and that are threatening to involve Russia into unnecessary conflict.
Well, that just reminds me of something I listened to the other day. There's a podcast that Radio Free Europe does every week. It's called something like The Power Vertical. And I listened to it for the first time just a couple days ago because, I go to their site every once in a while. Well, I go to their site every day, actually, it's kind of like a good source for news on Central Asia and the Caucasus. But it's just like our listeners probably know, it's a total propaganda outlet. Radio Free Europe used to be an open CIA project, and that's where they got all their money. Now it's just it's still tied to the CIA, but probably more covertly, but it is run by the American government. So it's this propaganda outlet for Europe, and they cover news all over the world. But I've seen the daily articles that this guy writes, and they're just over the top, like the worst kind of pro-U.S. anti-Russia propaganda that you can get. And listening to this podcast, it's just remarkable to listen to, like, a group of people that are so deluded, and it sounds like some of these people are just totally deluded and they're totally convinced of what they're saying. I'm not convinced all of them are like that. I think some of them are just purposefully lying and saying these things, but they're talking about Ukraine, and that in itself is an example of one of these kind of geopolitical provocations where the U.S. basically staged a coup in Ukraine 2 years ago, and I think wanted Russia to get pulled into an open military conflict. Didn't quite work out that way. Russia got Crimea back without any kind of fighting with the Ukrainian military, and Donetsk and Lugansk organized their own kind of people's protection units, their own militias, that probably with covert support from Russian military, but nothing overt. And so that in itself was this kind of big, large-scale provocation to try to be like, oh, well, you like Russians, you want to protect Russians, well, we're going to, basically kill a whole bunch of them, and what are you going to do about it? Of course, the natural response, and the response of a lot of people, like on the internet, was, oh, Putin's got to go after them and invade Ukraine now, and, totally cheering that on. Well, that's not the smartest move. I mean, it's the move that a lot of people wanted to see, just based on that initial emotional reaction, but it's not the smartest move. It's in the long term,
including a lot of people in his own Duma.
Yeah, a lot of Russians. But these guys on Radio Free Europe are talking about this, and they're talking about this latest leak that came out. It was released by, I believe it was the Ukraine, basically the SBU, the Ukrainian kind of CIA or KGB, and it was a recording of this Kremlin aide guy, he's pretty famous, Sergei Glaziev. He is kind of like an advisor, and it's an alleged phone recording of him talking with a guy in East Ukraine, basically saying, "Oh, we have to get these different cities to rise up, like in addition to those in Donetsk and Lugansk, like Odessa and Zaporizhzhia, I believe it's called." And so it was like this damning phone recording because it shows that early, like in February 2014, before Crimea was even, before they had their referendum and then were annexed by Russia, before this was going on, the Russians were planning these organized, protests and forming these militias and how evil it was. So you're listening to these guys talk about it, and it comes back to the kind of irrational discourse that we were talking about earlier. Because some of these guys, like I said, they sound like they're sincere in their delusions. But this one guy's like, well, I'm not convinced that it really says that much. I mean, the way they're describing it, it wasn't really a very motivated, professional outfit. They're basically just saying, oh, you guys do this, and we need you to do this, and it's not. There's not a whole lot of kind of military organization, or it kind of seemed like they were flying by the seat of their pants. It's like, but this in no way means that we shouldn't supply, lethal weapons to Ukraine, or like they kept coming back to this. No matter how they downplayed the actual recording, they made sure that they upped the totally irrational Western response and response from Ukraine, as if And this one guy even said, asked, "Oh, is this the smoking gun that we need?" And then the other guy says, "Well, why do we even need a smoking gun?" It's like, we don't even need evidence that Russia was behind the whole, civil war. We already know. And then again, one of the other guys says, "Well, no, I think it's important to have evidence." It's like, okay. Just hearing these people talk, and most of them are British, so they've got just really annoying British accents. Not that British accents are annoying, but these guys have annoying British accents because you can tell they're total jerks. And it's just quite an experience to listen to people like that. And again, it's just this experience like, what the heck is going on? How does this happen? How can people be so stupid? But not only stupid, like probably like mendacious about it. These people are lying and know they're lying, or at least some of them. And again, so this comes back to Ponerology. The third story that Lobaczewski tells is about his uncle, who was basically had to travel by foot all the way from the Soviet Union, after the revolution, back to Poland, and had the fear of having his head blown off every day. He had to keep his wits and know to pretend whether to be a white or a red, and keep his head down. And through this kind of strategic play acting, get back home, and how he was just, he had war stories, and he was a broken man because of it. And as a child, he would tell Lobaczewski and the other kids, these stories, and they were kind of, they're horror stories. They were terrified by them. And that, I think, was, at least according to the narrative that Lobaczewski provides, that was the first time in his life where this kind of apprehensive premonition started in his mind. Like, here's this horrible thing. Here's this horror story. It's like and then it came true. And that prompted the questions in him. Well, why do people lose their sanity? Why do they become mad? Why do they periodically just have this, impulse to destroy each other? What's the cause of this? And that's a big question. And incidentally, that was one of the big questions that Gurdjieff had, and that he deals with, in his works. And coming back to this idea of the library, it's, well, if you read all these books, if you read all these horror stories about humanity, you still won't understand them. And that's the point that Lobaczewski makes. And he's pretty critical about, the modern sciences as well, in addition to literature. So, he describes the social sciences. He says the main fault of the social sciences is that they eliminate critical standards. Now, critical standards, is basically like, it makes sense when you read the next bit. He says it eliminates critical standards and puts ethics on ice. So when you read something from the social sciences, basically you don't have a moral compass. It's this kind of moral relativism that gets put in the language of sociology, where you no longer have any kind of guide point or measure or value for how to judge what's actually going on. It's just these social forces described in these kind of vague terminology that doesn't get to the heart of the matter. And the same thing with political science. He says political science basically ignores the most essential factors. And I can tell this by reading books. I just read a book on Iran-Contra. Just came out a couple years ago. And it's probably, it's considered one of the best books on Iran-Contra. It's written by the head of, I can't remember the name of it, but some National Security Archives thing where these guys get, collect and archive all kinds of declassified documents and analyze them. And so this book is written based on all the latest FOIA requests and declassified documents, all the testimony from the Iran-Contra hearings and the independent counsel investigation after the scandal that went on for 6-7 years. And within all of that information, you've got diaries kept by all the main players. You've got their daily notes. This is stuff that they denied having when Iran-Contra broke, and that was only discovered and released in the years afterwards. And if you read this book or any other mainstream book, like academic book on politics and things like this, geopolitics or just the individual players involved, you don't see any mention of what is the most important thing, and that is the psychology of it and the psychopathology. So, you've got these descriptions of Oliver North, and they'll say, okay, yeah, he was he had no, he'd lie all the time. He was kind of this charismatic guy. He'd just make up stories and fly by the seat of his pants and make dumb decisions. So you read these things about him, it's missing the obvious. Well, this guy was and is, or does look like, a psychopath. Now, of course, political scientists will say, we're not qualified to make that kind of judgment. But that's the whole point, is that they may not be qualified, but by nobody saying it, that's the mystery that Lobaczewski calls this phenomenon's primary survival asset. The fact that no one knows about it, and no one talks about it, is the very way that these people get away with what they're doing. It's the way that an Oliver North can get in a position in the National Security Council that, that allows him to get away with just massive crimes. And, let's see. Lost my train of thought, but moving on from there. So you had social sciences and political sciences. Basically, neither are adequate to describe the phenomena, to understand the phenomena that Lobaczewski's talking about. So that's why he says that, he calls ponerology a new branch of science. Basically, this is an essential thing for the advancement of science, not only the advancement of science, but protecting humanity from complete collapse and destruction. And one of the other obstacles to this is what he calls natural language and the natural worldview. And he'll get into that, and he does get into that in later chapters. Basically, natural language is just, it's the words that we use when we just talk to each other about everyday things. Now, I'd think that a lot of the concepts in the book probably have their, at least, pseudo-facsimile natural language substitutes. Like, so people who have an interaction with a psychopath who don't know what a psychopath is and what psychopathy is, I mean, there are probably words we can use to describe them. Like, some people would just use the word jerk or a snake or a wolf in sheep's clothing. There are these kind of common words that we use, and we kind of know what they mean, but they're not very precise, and they don't really tell us exactly what's going on. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that we have this just natural language that we use that isn't scientific, that has no kind of theory behind it. But when we have these kind of ideas that we've just grown up with and learned from the people around us, we tend to be self-important about them. Lobaczewski describes it as like an egotism about our natural language. So not only are we kind of wrong about the way we're looking at the world, but we're super attached to our own ideas, and then we get insulted if anyone points out that we're wrong about it. So that's one of these barriers that Lobaczewski talks about in the book, and it's one of the reasons why, like I said earlier, one of the advantages of the book is this self-study aspect. You basically have to be willing to throw out some of your kind of like long-held and cherished beliefs about the way the world works in order to learn how it actually works and do something about it. And I guess that's one of the reasons why it's so hard even for scientists to get behind kind of the ideas in this book, is because basically, they're big babies. And
this softening language that we're so used to using, there is a resistance among many people to use the word psychopath or psychopathic, or even just pathological, to describe the behavior of individuals. One, because they just don't have that a kind of a deeper appreciation for what the word means. And two, I think that point about self-importance and wanting to go back to the default, soft language and words used to describe someone who's just a jerk or
just a communist,
or just a commie, or any number of things,
or a fascist.
Well, I like that word. I think that kind of says a lot, but maybe that's something I need to work on. This is this book, I think, helps us to give ourselves permission to call out the behavior of individuals, politicians, people that we interact with, for what they are, and it is calling someone or thinking of someone as psychopathic is strong. It is strong language, but I think what it does, if we're seeing things correctly and objectively, if we have a good criteria with which to make some kind of assessment, even if it's not exact, it permits us to respond more appropriately than we would otherwise. And I would just add to all of this that a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into the research and the publication of Political Ponerology. This is decades of work on the part of Lobaczewski and the network that he was in touch with, who were researching this. I think we honor the suffering and the importance of getting this information out there on the part of Lobaczewski and his colleagues when we study it and when we share it and when we try to apply it to the types of news that we're seeing every day. It's very special knowledge. It's not something that the world has made easy to bring into existence. In fact, the publication of it has been suppressed. We know that Lobaczewski sent a manuscript of it to no one less than Zbigniew Brzezinski, who suppressed it. We know that he sent copies of it to the Vatican, and they suppressed it, and they never got back to him. We know that Lobaczewski, and maybe we'll cover this in later episodes, was watched and oppressed and made victim of by the police. So there are forces at work, the psychopaths in particular, that have been working overtime not to make the dissemination of this information available on a large scale. So it really is something to appreciate and value, if for nothing else than the incredible dedication a number of people had to make it available to us.
Mm-hmm. And that is even hinted at in the story of the professor and the library being evacuated of all the important books on the topic, as if someone who knew what was going on, purposefully went through the library and took out all the relevant books on psychopathology. And I can imagine at first it was kind of like, well, how do they know? Why are they getting rid of these books? It became clear later, and it becomes clear later in the book that it is actively suppressed, and that psychopaths basically know that this information about themselves, objective psychological information, is their biggest Achilles heel. It's their biggest weak point. That if people actually knew what was going on and could even just describe what was going on accurately, that in itself would be a huge blow to all of these individuals. And that's why it's so important to muddy the waters and censor. Of course, this day and age, it's harder to totally censor things just because of the mass media and the internet and the connectivity between people all over the world. It's easier to get this information. It's harder to just outright suppress it. I mean, they can't just buy up all the copies of a certain book and burn them, because that book has been scanned and pirated, all over the internet, and, you can find it. And it would be a huge news story if all of a sudden this one book, disappeared. Because that does happen, every once in a while, an ex-military or CIA person will write a book with some classified information, and, the CIA will block the publication, and it becomes a huge news story. And then in the year afterwards, you find all of the redacted passages online, and people are wondering, why was this redacted? I mean, it becomes publicly accessible. So the way they do it these days is more by muddying the waters with things like, the books by Kevin Dutton and, Tom Sheridan and even John Ronson, who, has some pretty good stuff in his book, but then just some completely off-the-wall, backwards nonsense. And he just made up stuff too. So the people don't get an accurate picture. And you see this every once in a while in articles, like on the, our politicians psychopaths, our president's psychopaths, and then they list JFK up there. It's like, these people have no idea what they're talking about, and they just they muddy the waters, first of all, with an example like that, by including obvious non-psychopaths in with the psychopaths to give people a total wrong perception of what's going on. And also about the people that say, oh, well, psychopaths are great and they make great leaders because they don't have the flaws that normal people have that prevent them from making good, tough decisions.
They're decisive and fearless.
Yeah, which is, again, total nonsense. Again, stuff that we'll be getting into further on. And just one more point on the book itself and why the information in it is so important. And at the end of chapter 1, in this introduction, Lobaczewski says, okay, well, that said, we need some background information. And that's going to be what chapter 2 is about. And this background information, a lot of it will be familiar to psychologists, practicing therapists, people who are familiar with literature and psychopathology. But he says that there will be, certain details that may strike, even professionals as new. And the reason he gives for that is that the book really was written under unique circumstances, and that Lobaczewski and his colleagues had this, in scientific terms, they had this golden opportunity. It's like being thrown into a brand new ecosystem just teeming with life and new species, where they have this, this great opportunity to study these things which ordinarily, like in another ecosystem, might be not even there or hidden. But here it's like all out in the open, and it's very obvious. And it's like things are thrown into an even stronger relief, so that the picture is clearer and more obvious to someone who's looking for it. So that, that just shows, if you compare, for example, Western psychiatry and like the DSM, the Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders in the U.S., and you compare it to Lobaczewski's actually, there are a lot of differences, but Lobaczewski's is in a lot more detail, and he seems to have a lot more insight into what's going on, and that is because he had this golden opportunity to study these kind of creatures in their natural habitat, where things were a lot more obvious, because the one one of the main points that he alludes to in this first chapter is that the primary factor for this macrosocial disease is the presence of what he calls essential psychopathy, or what we just call psychopaths. But not only that, clinically low-level pathology. So these are people with psychopathologies that are not immediately obvious, that they operate at a low level. And so they can get by in ordinary society without, being, put in mental institutions, because they're not obviously mentally ill. It's this thing that runs underneath the surface, and that comes more and more to the surface as it's permitted in a pathocracy. Now, an example of that that I see is, for example, in groups like ISIS. Because I think that a group like ISIS, it's really a good case study for ponerology, and we'll get into that as we go through the book. But I was reading a couple of studies on kind of the academic world that tries to scientifically study terrorism and so-called radicalization. And so one of the questions they ask is, well, what makes people susceptible? Now, they're essentially trying to answer the question that Lobaczewski answered, but the conclusion they come to is that, well, we have no idea. There's just no criteria. These people don't display any obvious psychopathologies. They come from all different social classes and backgrounds. Some are rich, some are poor, some are highly educated, some have no education, some are religious, some are non-religious. This is exactly what Lobaczewski found. But what they're missing, this gets into the political science aspect again, is that the people doing this research lack the knowledge of these clinically low-level psychopathologies, and I doubt that they just don't have the measures to test for these sorts of things, on the very small sample study that they have of either captured or defected or rehabilitated members of these kinds of groups. And then, of course, they don't get into any of the kind of higher geopolitical angles and the espionage angles and black operations and things like that, because that's conspiracy theory. But we'll be getting into examples of that sort and all kinds of stuff as we go on. So like I said, or I think I said, we won't necessarily be talking about this every week. We'll come back to it every once in a while and kind of go through the book. Now, if readers want to kind of treat this as an interactive process or like a book club kind of thing, feel free to read along. And if you have any questions, to have them ready for the next time we do a show like this. I know that, for example, Tom had a question in the forum or in the chat about the instinctive substratum. So we'll actually be talking about that the next time we come around to an episode like this. But that is, I think that's enough for our little commentary on the introduction, Chapter 1 to Ponerology. Mm-hmm. Hope you got something out of it, and we'll be coming back to that. Anything else on that, or should we move on?
Well, there was an interesting article on SOT earlier this week, which was very, very illustrative of some of the things we talked about in Lobaczewski's experience at the university. The name of the article is Principal of Chicago's #1 rated school writes scathing resignation letter to Mayor Rahm Emanuel, rebukes ideological and politically driven policies. So basically, this principal of the Blaine Elementary School in Chicago, his name is Troy Anthony LaRaviere. He was made principal of the school back in 2010. He said he would bring this 6th-ranked school to the top of the list. And what he would be doing was using empirical evidence to support the school practices he and his fellow educators applied to the students.
Scandalous.
Yeah. So basically, this is a serious educator. He's been around for a number of years. He knows what he's doing. He knows what works. But the Chicago public schools began to criticize him for what he was doing, even though his methods were tried and true, and he did bring his school up to a #1 ranking. But he had been battling the public schools for years, and was threatened with being fired for speaking out against the types of policies that the politically run school system was trying to enforce on him. So he took matters into his own hands, and he preemptively resigned his position in protest of all of this bullshit that he was coming across. And just wanted to read a couple of passages from his letter, which, again, illustrate what we were discussing earlier quite well. He writes, behind the significant accomplishment are a series of basic concepts based on empirical evidence regarding effective school practices and thoughtful consideration of how we might apply those practices at Blaine. One fundamental element of improving the school was ending selective access to advanced curriculum. When I arrived, less than 30% of students had access to it. Today, more than 90% have access. So what he was basically saying was that, he had a system of making higher levels of curriculum and study available to inner city kids. He goes on, as is the case with most CPS schools, Chicago schools, Blaine has a talented, hardworking staff. Another critical element of our success was to involve that staff in an effort to create systems, relationships, and patterns of collaborative activity that are proven to improve teacher performance and therefore improve student achievement. In many ways, that was the easy part. And Blaine goes on. The difficult part was mustering the will and stamina to remain steadfast in our commitment to use evidence-based practice in the face of tremendous pressure from politicians like you to adopt baseless, quote, school reform ideas like, quote, tracking, school-based selective enrollment, quote, choice, and the over-evaluation of teachers. Ideas that are grounded in ideology and politics as opposed to proven effective educational methods. In a word, the biggest obstacle to Blaine becoming the #1 neighborhood school in Chicago was politics. And while many people contributed to this problem, nobody in our great city is more responsible for that political obstruction than you. So here in a public letter to an established publication that spoke of education, this principal, Troy LaRaviere, is addressing Rahm Emanuel, who we've discussed on previous shows, the mayor of Chicago, for basically imposing these kind of political policies that have no grounding in what actually works in education. And the principal goes on, he says, accordingly, in the summer of 2013, I began efforts to ensure that the residents of our city understood the negative consequences of your administration's backward and reckless management of our school district. I did so for the following reasons. Decisions by you and the board you appointed and completely controlled had damaging consequences for our school system. Although your board was unelected and therefore unaccountable to the residents of Chicago, you were indeed elected and could be held accountable. As a public servant, it was my responsibility to ensure the public understood the negative consequences of your school-related decision-making so they can hold you and your board accountable. So for the next 3 years, I consistently and publicly advocated for credible evidence-based education policies. This, in turn, made me also be a consistent public critic of the ideological and politically driven policies coming out of your office and implemented by your hand-picked board. In closing, should you ever decide to prioritize learning over the profits of your campaign donors, feel free to reach out to me and the principals I was elected to represent. We have an abundance of ideas for improving the system for the students we serve. In the meantime, we will continue in our efforts to vigorously advocate for the kind of effective, evidence-based education policies and practices that your office does its best to ignore and suppress. So basically, this principle was seeing Ponerization in action, headed by Rahm Emanuel, who, as the mayor of Chicago, we know has done a number of egregious things in his leadership role. He has overseen Homan Square, which is this black site where people are kept for days on end without any legal counsel. People have been tortured at this place. There was the story of Laquan McDonald late last fall, where the police had video of a shooting where they killed an innocent young black man. So Rahm Emanuel, who was also formerly part of Obama's staff, I think he was the chief of staff for a couple of years early on in the Obama administration, and also held a key position with the Clintons. This guy is, I dare say, psychopathic in his administration of being the mayor of Chicago. And it wasn't only affecting the police force. He's also had his hand in trying to trying to suppress the level of education in Chicago. So I just thought that was an interesting story. And just as an aside, Emmanuel's father was basically part of I think it was one of the terrorist organizations in Israel during its establishment, who was known for murdering British soldiers and bombing buses. He was also part of a gang that assassinated a Swedish leader who was trying to bring together the Israeli and Palestinian politicians in trying to create some kind of agreeable situation there. So, it runs in the family, so to say.
And Chicago itself is like crime capital, like white crime capital. Sibel Edmonds says that Chicago was basically one of the most important hubs for all the things she was talking about. Kind of the drugs trafficking, arms trafficking, nuclear trafficking, all of the kind of dark, behind-the-scenes illegal operations involving intelligence agencies and just these kind of criminal operators from various states. That all that stuff was pretty much based in Chicago. So, and it's still going on, and so Emmanuel's probably like, their guy on the ground, coordinating all those things.
Right, and keeping kids dumbed down and keeping the police state kind of in full force over there. There was a story of how I think the G20 or one of these groups had met in 2012 or 2010, and Emmanuel brought in a number of independent contractors. He basically made a number of federal agencies marshals for keeping the order, which basically meant suppressing any kind of protests against this meeting. So yeah, he is a kind of ponerizing force put on the ground in Chicago.
Well, just the example of a figure like Rahm Emanuel, it reminds me of something that I did want to say about this chapter in Ponerology, about the library of books. And I don't think I gave the impression quite correctly about this, hypothetical library that Lobaczewski describes. It's not as if, Ponerology is the only book you need to read. He himself was kind of indebted to a whole bunch of other literature, and I think it's important for everyone who wants to understand these types of phenomena to read as much as possible from a whole bunch of different fields, and that includes, literary descriptions. And so, for example, he lists, accounts of people who were in concentration camps, and Solzhenitsyn on the Gulag in the Soviet Union, to get an idea, first of all, of just the conditions and the level of evil that these systems can perpetrate. And to that, you can add biographies. One book I'm currently reading is David Talbot's book on Alan Dulles, The Devil's Chessboard. And I'm only about a quarter of the way through, and already, even though it has the flaws of any kind of literary or political book like Lobaczewski describes, once you have the information from Ponerology, then you can read other books with a new frame of mind and see what's going on. And Talbot essentially describes a psychopath, and Alan Dulles was a big, nasty psychopath. And you think about it, he was head of the CIA. He was intimately involved in all sorts of, this creation of the CIA, OSS before then, all kinds of black operations, and the entire kind of Cold War, anti-communist, anti-Russian, anti-Soviet Union kind of meme or propaganda line at the time, and not only propaganda, but actually involving, actual black operations or military engagements, coup d'état, coups all over the world. And so if you read biographies, you can get an idea of who these people were and kind of place them in this kind of this wider picture. So Dulles, for example, first of all, the big shocker, which I really didn't know in detail, but he really was a fascist, and I use that word kind of half jokingly, but he was friends with a whole bunch of Nazis, before and during the war, and I knew he was kind of involved in Project Paperclip, but I had no idea just how involved he was, and that he basically fought to protect his Nazi friends after the war, make sure they had safe passage, made sure as many of them as possible got out, and avoided the Nuremberg trials. And just it's amazing to read what this guy was like, and even the descriptions of him in his interpersonal life from his wife and his mistress, and I believe it was one of his mistresses over in Europe when he was doing all this spy work, who said she told a story about him. I'm just going to read one paragraph because it's kind of telling, and it's just one in a series of anecdotes about just how evil this guy was. So this lady's name was Mary Bancroft, and so Talbot writes, but even the sophisticated Mary found herself unnerved by one of her conversations with Dulles. She had observed that, despite his cunning reputation, Allen always seemed so open and trusting, even with people about whom he clearly harbored suspicions, or whom he actually had the goods on, in quotes. As he listened to Mary, Dulles grinned. Quote, I like to watch the little mice sniffing at the cheese just before they venture into the little trap, he told her. I like to see their expressions when it snaps shut, breaking their little necks. So this is how he was describing just pretty much everyone that he dealt with on a daily basis. That he might appear open and charming and trusting, but he was really just watching them, waiting for their necks to be snapped. And sometimes quite literally. I mean, Dulles was involved in all kinds of nasty stuff. And he would destroy people's lives. Even people that had considered him as his friends. If they were placed in a certain position that would be convenient for him, he would totally throw them under the bus. He did this to an entire family and accused them of, he spread the rumor that they were basically spying on behalf of the U.S. for in these communist countries, which was totally untrue. And these guys, this one guy had been his friend before, and so the communists basically then round up this guy and his entire family and hold them for years, torture them. And it was all because Dulles just wanted to, be a shit disturber. He wanted the communists to think that there was this, massive spy ring going on when he just totally made it up. So he ruined these people's lives just because it was convenient, because they were in the right place at the right time, and he could get away with it. And he did that repeatedly. And he was actually the guy that was responsible for Nixon becoming a big thing, in the 50s. So Nixon was Dulles's little, how'd you put it?
Pet project.
Yeah, pet project. But there's all kinds of stuff in this book. It's pretty good. I'd recommend it. But maybe we can move on to some news. What's going on, William?
Well, something you won't read in any U.S. mainstream media, but past couple of days, September 2nd through the 3rd, we had the Eastern Economic Forum, which is the second one being held annually in Vladivostok, Russia, by a president's decree in order to promote and accelerate development of the Eastern European economy and expand international cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. And there's about 3,300 attendees that showed up, and they had more than 200 agreements that came out to about $26 billion worth of projects. I thought that was pretty fascinating that the U.S. had just expanded the sanctions against Russia but Russia decided not to retaliate with sanctions. So here we see a little another maneuver where, well, okay, you want to sanction us, we'll just create markets in other areas to the west of the U.S. And it's a pretty bold move. He had an opening address where he covered a lot of ground, including the digital economy. He wants to open that up and make it more common space to do transactions. Trying to stabilize energy prices with the Asia Pacific, and build up the Far East infrastructure. Of course, he puts a little dig to the IMF on that for nations that could submit more money to help with this infrastructure aren't. He wants it to be more fair and balanced. He wants a Seoul to Moscow transport cooperation, which it's kind of interesting because you got to go through North Korea to get this kind of a transportation. He wants Russia, Japan to be natural partners in economic and regional security spheres. He brought up the issue of Crimea territory. He's saying that is historically closed. No sense arguing or making fuss about it. It's a done deal. Quit talking about it. Russia is going to try to return North Korea to the path of negotiations. So it's not only economics, but he's getting into some political stuff too. And he reiterates that the Minsk agreements should be fully implemented without any restrictions. And Russia is ready for full cooperation with Washington, but wants interests respected. But yeah, it's pretty strong stuff and a lot of something that you won't hear here in the U.S., but I thought it was quite fascinating to see this come about.
Yeah, there's been a few interesting developments with Russia and Japan, which has been interesting to see them getting closer, and especially economically. But there's the whole Kuril Islands thing that, well, if you look, there's the conflict between Japan and Russia over the Kuril Islands, which the Soviet Union took over after World War II. Expelled all the Japanese living there. Now, on the few islands that are inhabited, you've got Russians and Russian Ukrainians that live there. Then you've got the conflict between China and the Philippines. So when the previous Philippines president, Aquino, was in power, the U.S. basically used him in order to start this this kind of tribunal over the South China Sea and the use of what are those rocks called? Well, anyways, now Duterte is in power, and it's like the U.S. has set up these conflicts, and the actual people living in these regions, like Russia, Japan, China, the Philippines, they're like, well, it's not really that big a deal. We can get around it. I mean, even with the Kuril Islands, I mean, it's presented as this huge kind of point of contention between Japan and Russia, when they've been getting along just fine for several years. I mean, yeah, it is officially the Japanese want them, the Russians have them, and Russia won't give them back, and blah blah blah. But they agree over like fishing rights and use of the sea passages, and same with China and the Philippines, where Duterte hasn't made a big deal out of it. He hasn't really made, as far as I know, any big statements about the Hague ruling on this controversy, and China and the Philippines just still kind of get along. So it's like the U.S. is kind of trying to manipulate these fracture points, but they're doing it from so far away, and with so little understanding of the actual people involved, that it doesn't really seem to be having any huge effect, which just suggests to me that they'll only try to escalate things even further once they can't make a big deal out of these issues.
Yeah, they've got some smarter leaders now that are seeing through some of this stuff. So just go away, back off. We can take care of this.
Mm-hmm.
And what's fascinating is this persistent kind of working and drive on the part of Putin and Russia to say, to Japan, who's aligned with the U.S. militarily, let's do business. Let's get things going. Let's make agreements where we can. He did this also with Saudi Arabia at some point. He did it a few weeks ago with Turkey. He's even had Netanyahu over to meet with him and discuss various deals. So in the face of all of this other kind of political fracture points, as Harrison put it, there is this understanding or this appeal to the more kind of rational and constructive thinking involved in just having a successful economy and making good deals.
Yeah, I mean, you don't see the U.S. making these kind of offers. Mm-hmm. The only thing you get out of the IMF is, we'll give you loans, but you got to have all these austerity measures, which just stifles any kind of economic progress. So, everyone's got to look somewhere else. And so they're seeing other countries who are in the same position want to improve their economies and say, well, they got nowhere else to go but to look at Russia and China and make things happen, because it isn't going to happen with the U.S.
Well, I read the first part of Chinese President Xi Jinping's statement at the G20, where he kind of gave a description of China's kind of economic and developmental plans. And just one thing stood out to me, because he's talking about China's 17th five-year plan or something, and how they're proceeding with implementing it. And it just made me think, well, how many countries have long-term plans? Does the U.S. ever come up with a strategy? Okay, in the next 5 to 10 years, we need to develop these things in certain ways to reach this final goal. I don't know if they actually do that. I never see them actually. I never see statements to that effect in the news. It's like whatever legislation they introduce, it's just like whatever their corporate masters have told them that they want to get done, but they have no kind of long-term planning that will actually benefit ordinary Americans.
Right. We maximize profits and we screw the other guy.
Yeah.
And that's really what TTP is all about, and what the Europeans have kind of recognized and are refusing to agree to. As it looks like, this trade agreement, which Obama has desperately been pushing because he'd like it to go through before he leaves office, will probably not go through. What the TTP is kind of there for is purely to protect corporate interests, where they have absolutely no responsibility and can't be held accountable for any kind of damaging effects they may have on the people surrounding the factories or the businesses that are created in various places. So Obama's like, and the TTP is basically like, come on guys, this is really good for you, and everybody's looking at the black and white and saying, no, this is awful. This completely benefits you guys, and on top of it, there's nothing in it for us. But
that had to be leaked out. Only certain people could see the actual document. And so there was no transparency at all for any kind of discussion about it, or for the people to even understand what was happening, which is pretty telling in and of itself.
Yes. We've discussed this on the show, and there have been articles about it on SOT. Basically, whoever was voting through the TTP in the U.S. and elsewhere had to go into some kind of basement, vaulted, protected office space to read sections of the TTP, could bring no pen and paper to record or take notes of the information, and for obvious reasons.
What about this G20 thing? What's that?
Yeah, the G20 is going on right now, and I think it wraps up on Monday. Pretty big shindig going on there in Hangzhou, China. Now, what is the G20? Well, it's a international forum for governments and central bank governors from 20 major economies. And it was founded back in 1999 with the aim of studying and reviewing and promoting high-level discussions of policy issues pertaining to the promotion of international financial stability. So there's 19 members, and the 20th one would be the European Union. You have Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. Now, these countries collectively account for about 85% of the gross world product and 80% of world trade. So it's a pretty big shindig. It's been getting a lot more attention, of course, when they meet than what everything says. So let's see. What's some of the big things that happened during that time? Well, of course, you've got Xi, who made his comments, and I liked one of them. We should turn the G20 group into an action team instead of a talk shop. Because mostly that's what it seems like it is, just a bunch of people getting around, chit-chatting, and you never really see too many results from it.
Posing for photos.
Yeah, just having a good time. But he gives some pretty good warnings, too. The global economy is being threatened by rising protectionism and risks from highly leveraged financial markets. The global economy has arrived at a crucial juncture, he says. In the face of sluggish demand, volatile financial markets, and feeble trade and investment. Growth drivers from the previous round of technological progress are gradually fading, while a new round of technological and industrial revolution has yet to gain momentum. So we've seen a lot of background stuff going on, too, where people are trying to meet in the sidelines, where you have Obama and Putin trying to meet, and Xi and Erdogan had some meetings, and there's just all kinds of stuff going on, but you don't see anything really coming out of it, especially with Obama and Putin on the Syria thing. There's some back and forth. Oh, we're real close, and then Washington goes, oh, well, no, we're not real close, and so it's going to be fascinating to see what happens on Monday when some more face-to-faces happen.
Well, there's some interesting background in Europe going on at this time. In an article on Novorossiya today, one article we carried had this question in its title: "Is war on the horizon as Germany prepares for the worst?" So basically, I think it was about a week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, the German government basically warned its people to prepare itself. Among other things, they've had doctors receive orders telling them that they must report to a military center in service to the army within a few days, and not to discuss it with anyone. And they were telling citizens to stockpile food and water in the event of an emergency which threatens our existence, quote unquote. The Czech Republic told its citizens to begin preparing for the worst. A few days later, Finland began telling its citizens to begin stockpiling food and water. And at the same time, you have this huge mobilization of Russian troops to the order of 300,000 men. And that included rifle brigades, support brigades, mobilization brigades.
They called them snap checks, right?
Yeah, but
it was huge.
But it was huge, and so
Crimea was in there too.
Yeah, we don't know at this time how much of this is posturing and bluffing, or how much of all of this points to the very real possibility of major conflict in Eastern Europe and the borders of Russia. Certainly, it's distressing, I think, to hear this announcement on the part of Germany to prepare yourself for, and begin stockpiling stuff. We know Germany is a vassal state of the U.S. We know that that Merkel is pretty much under the thumb of the Obama administration and has continued her, kind of anti-Russian rhetoric along with the U.S. So we'll see, I think, in the coming weeks whether or not this leads to an actual greater conflict.
I doubt it. I think they're just
bluffing,
trying to scare the people into fear of this mythical Russian invasion. That Russia's going to take over Europe. I doubt it, but we'll see. I don't know. But any other stories before we go to our Police State Roundup? No? Okay.
Where's your warrant?
Show me the warrant now. Show me the warrant.
Where's your warrant?
You don't need a warrant.
Yes, you do.
Wow, they just said they did not have a warrant. Get out of my house unless you have a warrant right now.
If you keep smiling at me like this is some kind of funny thing,
Okay, there's nothing funny about this.
okay, then stop smiling. Right. Hands in your head. Do it now.
So, Brent, you there? Hey.
Yeah, how's it going?
Good.
Quite a lot of interesting stuff happening in the news lately. One of the more interesting things is that Brock Turner has been released after 3 months of being in jail. He was basically convicted of rape charges not too long ago. It was all over the news. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the case. But I found a similar story where in Arkansas, a hot check division jailed a cancer patient for bouncing checks totaling $41, and he was in jail for 3 months. So it's kind of curious to me that somebody who commits a violent act of rape gets the same amount of time as somebody who's a cancer patient and bouncing checks. Just kind of shows you the state of justice in the United States of America. Mm-hmm. Also kind of gaining momentum in the news is this whole protest happening out in North Dakota. There's members of the Standing Rock tribe out there. They're protesting the construction of a huge oil pipeline that goes right across their land. And there's been some word out about how the company hasn't got the proper permits from the Army Corps of Engineers. So there have been between hundreds and a couple thousand of protesters out there every day, kind of just like, blocking the construction, doing what they can to slow down the progress. And just recently, I found a story on NBC. This is one of the first stories I found on a major news outlet where they're talking about it. And it's very interesting because it's over a incident that happened either today or yesterday. Looks like September 3rd, so yesterday. They basically were blocking the construction, and it's unclear who got quote-unquote violent first. NBC is claiming that the protesters came at the the construction crews with sticks and flagpoles, and they released dogs and pepper spray on them. Now, another article from Free Thought Project shows completely, 180-degree view that they were peacefully protesting, and that these dogs were like basically released on them. And there's one really incredible picture that somebody snapped of one of these attack dogs being held back by its handler. The dog has blood all over its mouth, and the tweet says that basically that was from one of the protesters. So this situation out there is very interesting. Basically, they're protesting because they are worried about their water supply being contaminated by potential leaks. And the construction is also going across sacred land, which is, 100-year-old burial grounds and stuff. They basically already destroyed one huge area, which was a burial ground. Just in one day, they took out a couple 100 years worth of history. So that's still ongoing. You can follow that on Twitter. Also big in the news, this guy Colin Kaepernick. Have you heard about him?
Mm-hmm.
This has been going around all over Facebook. It's a huge story. Very interestingly, though, there seems to be a lot of ire directed at him for his choice not to stand during the national anthem during, football games. He's a football star. But nobody's really talking about, the reason that he's giving for not standing. He's concerned about police brutality and violence against African Americans. He also came out and basically called both our presidential candidates, or both our mainstream presidential candidates, criminal. And I have not heard anybody discussing that whatsoever. Now, apparently, a police union is threatening to stop working unless the 49ers, quote, take action against Kaepernick. So it's really kind of ridiculous. We ostensibly have this, right to free speech and this right to express ourselves. But it's anytime anybody, with some clout with the public for whatever reason decides to do that, decides to exercise their right, they immediately get this huge firestorm of criticism from the left and from the right, which is really ridiculous. I actually saw a couple tweets from veterans who were supporting him, and they said basically, we didn't. One guy's tweet was something like, we go to war to defend your right to express yourself, not, because of some song. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was interesting.
Kaepernick has also pledged to give his first $1 million and just donate it to local communities.
Yeah, it says he is basically donating $1 million. Let's see, quote, I am currently working with organizations to be involved in making sure that I'm actively in these communities, as well as donating the first $1 million I make this year to different organizations to help these communities and help these people. So he's not just doing this for attention, he's putting actions behind his words. And it blows my mind that he's been taking such heat from the talking heads on this. It just shows that there's real sort of ire from the elite. They control the talking heads, and they want to avoid any sort of real criticism of the status quo with police brutality. They really don't want to change, and that's also evident here in New York City. There's been a push to basically retrain and change the way some of the policing happens here in the city. There was this proposal that was out back in 2014 to basically make it so that police would have to identify themselves, give their name, their badge number, and their department, as well as hand citizens a card which has a phone number to a civil review board, which basically, any complaints you have, you can address to them. And it's a very, very light kind of thing. We're not talking about disarming the police. We're not talking about scaling back their numbers. We're just talking about, maybe making it a little bit more easy for them to, handle complaints or to make complaints. And that was been vehemently resisted by Bill Bratton and de Blasio. And, it's like anytime there's a little, sort of public oversight decision, they kick and scream against it. And they really get into saying how it's an unprecedented intrusion into police work. And they resist it. Now it's back up in front of the board, or it's trying to get there. And the motion actually has enough support to override a veto. But one of de Blasio's allies is preventing it from even coming to the floor. So it's kind of funny to see that, when democracy tries to rear its quote unquote ugly head, they have all these little ways that they can maneuver around it so that they can just, continue to do what they want.
Well, just
some other interest
on Bill Bratton.
I'll go for it.
He is one of these guys. He recently, or is going to step down, I think, from his position. He's one
next
of these,
year.
Oh, that's next year. He's been through this kind of revolving door of private security industry and positions of heading police departments for many years. So he is part and parcel of the security state. I mean, he stands to make a profit every time the police state has been reinforced by some level of security industry. And we've seen the same thing with, I think it was the mayor of Atlanta, who was a proponent of Israeli trained police departments, and also going to these kinds of security state conventions where arms and various services are sold. So just that point there to add about Bill Bratton.
Yeah, he's definitely one of the major players in the elite that has consistently been pushing and responsible for more violent police behavior. He was a big proponent of the broken windows policy, which I think was back in the 90s when he was here under Giuliani. And this policy was basically that they were going to push the officers to arrest and prosecute people for very minor crimes, turnstile jumping, breaking windows is just where the name came from, graffiti, that kind of stuff. And the logic there was that if you could cut down on the minor crime, that it would sort of have this trickle up effect where major crime would also be prevented. And there was really no good evidence or research to show that policy, that logic had any weight to it. And in fact, it was, any legitimate research that came out showed quite the opposite. So he's definitely one of these major players. And anytime anyone suggests we reel in the police with some sort of legislative effort, he vehemently resists it. So it makes you wonder, who's pulling his strings? Is he just a useful idiot, or is he a part of something else? Mm-hmm. He was also a player in Chicago, and Chicago is another one of the most notoriously violent police departments in the country. So, it follows this guy around like flies on doggy do. Let's see. So, interesting other stories. There's this one story that we talked about not too long ago, 19-year-old Zachary Hammond. He was killed by this cop in South Carolina. He was, eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. This was about a year ago. But mysteriously and kind of cryptically, his police department decided to fire him over the weekend. His last day will be, looks like on Friday. And the statement that the police chief gave was really vague, citing some sort of personal matter. So it makes you wonder if this guy has done something else that's just not made the headlines. These cops, one thing that I've noticed, a big trend, is that when you have a cop that commits some sort of heinously violent action against a civilian, regardless of circumstance, they tend to pop up again. There's been cops that, they repeatedly do this kind of behavior, and nothing is done to stop them. They're not prosecuted. They're not fired. So it makes me wonder, if he's done something yet again, and now the police chief has just had enough. Maybe he didn't want to deal with the whole controversy, that he had to deal with last year. So just saved himself some trouble. The family in that situation actually received over $2 million settlement from the city. So it really becomes a financial thing. Even though, no amount of money can replace someone's lost child. Some really other interesting stories. There's been some interesting clown sightings in South Carolina. There've been, now it's come to the point where police are actually saying anyone dressed as a clown is able to be arrested based on charges of concealing their identity. But the interesting part comes from the details of these reports on the clowns is that they're just kind of appearing in places and they're not interacting with people. They're just kind of looking at them, or there was rumor that a group of children reported seeing them and they were trying to be lured in the woods with lasers and cash. So it's really I don't know what to make of this story. It just seems very, kind of creepy and disturbing.
The MICs. The men in clown suits.
Yeah, that kind of popped in my head too. Could this be some sort of weird, hyperdimensional thing? Who knows? It's just very, very odd. And the one woman that actually was close enough to hear them said that she heard them whispering and making, quote, strange noises. Strange noises is another thing that comes along with interactions with these like weird sort of high strangeness critters. But getting back to the police, there's a story from North Carolina where this troubled mom had her 14-year-old daughter who was being extremely difficult. She didn't know what to do. And this older officer, kind of offered to take her under her wing and sort of like, help her stay out of trouble. And basically, the cop ended up having sex with this girl and getting her pregnant. And we're talking about a 14-year-old child here. Thankfully, he's been arrested and charges are going to be filed against him. But, anytime you have somebody, taking an interest in a young child, we should always be very careful. Parents especially should really guard their children. Regardless of circumstance, you really need to be super careful, especially with people in positions of authority, because they can often use that authority to, either cover up or intimidate, the victim. And there's one more story I have here. There's a cop left his canine in a hot car for days, and the dog died, but he didn't even realize until he could smell it in the car. This is very strange, which goes to show you that some of these officers really, they don't have much of concern at all for the animals in their care or the people under their authority. There just needs to be like some sort of severe overhaul to the way that we do policing in this country. And I don't think it's going to happen. I think something major, we need to hit a super severe breaking point before we'll be able to have the sort of mass awareness that we need in order to push past the blockades that the elite keep throwing up. Because, as I said before, they resist all sorts of efforts to reel in these police officers or to overhaul their training or to make any sort of, little moderate changes to the way the policing is done here in America. Interesting thing that I saw not too long ago was that there was a big hack on George Soros's foundation. And, one of the emails that was leaked talked about how he wanted to use this sort of epidemic of police violence in order to kind of nationalize the police force. And while, we definitely do need some sort of major overhaul, I don't think, creating a sort of more complicated national hierarchy is going to solve any of the problems. If anything, I think it would actually make things worse. But I found it very interesting that was kind of the elite's, response. So maybe, and this is me putting on my tinfoil hat here, maybe the reason they're resisting a lot of these minor sort of, scale backs in the way the policing is being handled is, they want it to get worse. They want it to be really violent and really bad to the point where any sort of solution being proffered by them is going to be gobbled up immediately by the masses. And, while it may sound good on the surface, we all know that, when the elite trend to offer, the public a solution to a problem, it's generally because it benefits them and not us. It's a very, very interesting time. A lot of fascinating stories. I wrote this article last week about how the police are becoming more of a danger to themselves and other people. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in that article that talks about how, they aren't only, creating a dangerous situation for citizens, but they're also making their job and their positions, as individual officers, much more dangerous. Not only are they, behaving more violently, but they're making it very difficult, to interact with the public. You have a public that's almost terrorized by these guys in uniform. And, when you're being terrorized by officers in uniform, you're not going to want to interact with them. You're going to want to limit, any interaction that you have with them and just kind of avoid them altogether. And, police need information in order to do their job. They can't investigate crimes without, talking to people. But the more violent and the more unruly they become, the less people are going to be willing to come forward. And it strikes me as almost, blindingly obvious, but for some reason, the officers don't really, they don't take to it. And anytime you see a story about an officer that does attempt to, reel in their fellow officers, they get, slammed. Yeah, there was a story about a woman officer who tried to peel off an officer beating a guy. I think it was a kid, actually. I can't have the story in front of me. And she had basically the book thrown at her. She was fired and all this stuff. I believe she was the only woman in that department as well, and she was a lesbian. So, it's curious as to whether or not, they were going after her because of her behavior or because of her gender and her sexual orientation. This was probably in the South somewhere, if I can recall the details. But yeah, it's definitely crazy out there. Don't know where it's going, but one thing we can, doggy. One thing for sure is that, nothing's going to change until, something major happens in order to drive that change. So hopefully, just being aware of all this stuff and sharing it, we can kind of, protect ourselves and our listeners. If our listeners are aware of all these stories, maybe they can, make a choice at some point in time where, they avoid some sort of violent outcome. At least that's kind of my hope covering this stuff.
Good. Yeah. I mean, it's just nonstop, and things aren't getting any better. So I think the only thing we can take away at this point is to avoid the cops like the plague. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was a story about a man. I put this in the last article that I wrote. A story about a guy whose wife was carjacked in their home in the suburbs. I'm not really sure where in the country it was. I forget. But he, called the police, and this was an African-American couple, and their assailant was African-American. And he went out to greet the police when they arrived, and he, opened the garage door, and he was in the garage. And without even saying a word, the cops opened fire at him, and they hit him in the leg. And that's like clear violation of the already established protocol. Police are supposed to identify themselves, they're not supposed to just twitch and they hear a noise and all of a sudden they're unloading their guns at someone. Like that's just not how it's supposed to work. There's another story in the article that I wrote. I think we talked about this already, but there was a family that was at home and officers got a report. Somebody called and said that there was a suspicious person in this cul-de-sac, and officers got there. They didn't know what to do, started wandering around the house that was described. And for some reason, they decided to enter the home. I guess the back door was unlocked. They walked into the kitchen, and the dog, heard a noise, and it barked at them. They shot the dog. The family was in the living room. They heard the noise. The father went to investigate. This was a young couple and their 1-year-old child. The man went to investigate. As soon as he opens the door to the kitchen, the guns go off, and they hit him. Thankfully, he wasn't killed, but and they actually, in that incident, one of the officers was shot. And it's not really clear how, the officer was shot, but it was one of the other officers that shot him. So it's just, these guys they're dangerous. They're not trained. They're trained poorly, or they're trained, not the way they should be. And they don't have the wherewithal to make rational decisions, in a situation where they have to make these life and death snap judgments. So what are you going to do? Just don't call the police. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think that's the end of our show. Thanks again, Brent.
Thanks, Brent.
Yeah, we look forward as usual to, or we don't. It's kind of a mixed thing because we have you on like almost every week, and on the one hand we're happy to have you on, but on the other hand it's like, oh no, Brent's on again. He's going to have some more depressing stories.
It's kind of a mixed bag, right? It's like we kind of have to be aware of this stuff. On one hand, you don't want to just ignore it, but on the other hand, like being aware of it is really depressing. Like, mm-hmm. I mean, it's good to kind of, after you hear this kind of stuff, put on some music, relax, maybe play with your dog or your cat, or go for a walk outside in the sunshine, while the weather's still nice.
Yeah.
There's definitely a lot of ways you can do it. I'll plug the breathing and meditation program, Aeroiolas. If you go to eebreathe.org, there's a wonderful program there put up by a lot of this came from Miss Laura Knight Yachik, who basically started Signs of the Times. And it is so incredible in just bringing on relaxation and processing, difficult emotions, especially the difficult emotions that get aroused by this sort of material. And it's a very healthy way to sort of, deal and process and kind of rejuvenate after hearing all this terrible kind of news.
And read Ponerology. It helps too.
Yeah, Political Ponerology. Amazing book. Definitely read it. Everybody should read it.
Yeah, in fact,
tough read, but it's worth it.
Read Ponerology and then do Irrationality.
And then
Definitely
make some jokes about cops because it helps to laugh too.
Yes.
All
Laughing
right.
is very clutch.
Okay, well, thanks, Brent. We'll talk to you again next week.
Yeah, no problem. Take care, guys.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, we're going to call it quits for today. So thanks, everyone, for listening. Remember, we'll be coming back to topic of Ponerology. Of course, we'll be coming back to more Police State Roundups, but feel free to read the book and have some questions. We'll be glad to answer them if you want to call in future weeks or send in questions. You can put them in the chat room, either way, or the forum. And we'll get to them, and hopefully we can share some of the little juicy tidbits in there that kind of get forgotten or not really focused on, because there really aren't a lot of people online talking about Ponerology, so this is pretty much the only place you can get a sort of analysis or commentary on it. So we're happy to do that. It's fun because we like the book. With that said, everyone take care, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Goodbye.
Be well.